Hello everyone, today we are going to start from your grade 10 history book. The first unit of your history book is Sources of Studying History. Now Bhutala, we are going to learn about our history. Before we are learning our history, before we are going to learn the history, so we have to get the help from the sources. Okay, so here let's go to the introduction. Sources are needed to study history, we know, otherwise we can't learn about the history. So the sources that help us to study history are diverse. So there can be seen a diversity, differences between them. So in this unit, you will learn the areas such as introduction to sources, the way how history is built on the information provided by the sources and benefits of studying history. Okay, let's go to the lesson again. Classification of sources. Here, history is a subject which studies the past human activities. Yes, we know about that since in our childhood. When we are learning history, we are going to our past and we are learning our human activities. The people who lived in past, so we are learning their past human activities. So when we study the history of hundreds and thousands of years back, so we find writings and various creations made by people who lived in those ages, especially the people who lived in cave season, cave age. So they are called sources. Because information about past human activities can be extracted from them, especially the Puttara, especially archaeological excavations. When they are doing archaeological excavations, normally we are find the writings and their instruments and all. So we are calling them as sources. So the sources which belong to each different age provide us a good understanding about those eras and their social backgrounds. Not only that, here we are learning their economical background too. So thus, when the information taken from those sources are studied logically, the history about people's lives in each period is formed. Now here, as there are a number of sources which are available to study history, they are mainly divided into two. Now here Putala, when we are learning about history, we have pay our attention to the following factors, especially literary sources and the archaeological sources. Okay, books and documents written at different time periods by people who lived in the past are considered literary sources. Okay, now here keep this in your mind. Normally we are calling literary sources for the writing. Books and documents written at different time periods by people who lived in the past are considered literary sources. Relics, monuments, coins, inscriptions, and various ruins which are unearthed from archaeological excavations and experiments are called archaeological sources. Next, let's discuss the above mentioned two types of further using the sources which are helpful to study the history of Sri Lanka. Okay, now we all know normally we are using books and documents to learn about the history. So we are calling them as literary sources, and there are some archaeological sources as well. So these things are more beneficial when we are learning about the past events, that means history. Now here if we take the literary sources which can be used to study history of Sri Lanka, these are more beneficial. So can be categorized into two as local literary sources and foreign literary sources. Okay, now itself you have to underline these points, local literary sources and the foreign literary sources. Okay, the text written by Sri Lankans in the form of prose to poetry from time to time about 2000 years ago are considered local literary sources. Okay, so we are calling them as local literary sources. Apart from the text written by Sri Lankans, some books were written by foreigners. Here, foreigners who were interested in Sri Lanka, or else some foreign writers have included information about Sri Lanka in the books they wrote. So, thus the books written by foreign writers mentioning information about Sri Lanka are called foreign literary sources. Now here there are some foreign writers as well as Sri Lankan writers too. So these people, they mentioned about our country, especially they mentioned about the history of our country. Local literary sources. Among the local literary sources in Sri Lanka, Deepavamsa is considered the oldest text. Very important, underline. So here the Deepavamsa was written in about 4th century. The Deepavamsa consists of historical information of this country up to the end of the King Mahasen's ruling period and descriptions of the history of Buddhist order Sasana in this country. So here Putala, Deepavamsa is the oldest literary sources in our country, and here it was written in about 4th century AD. So here it consists of historical information about country up to the end of the King Mahasen's ruling period. And here there are some restrictions of the country, but here mostly it's included about the Buddhist order. Now you look at this picture, figure 1.1. Ancient literary and religious informations as well as the Vamsakatha have been written in olives. So Sri Lanka inherits a tradition of talipots, which belong to a long period of time. Here, when you visit to museum or else there are some Buddhist libraries and all, especially in the temples also, you can see this type of books. Normally, all the people, they use these type of books to note out their things. So, but some historical events have been recorded briefly in Deepavamsa, but there are some historical events have been recorded briefly, shortly in Deepavamsa. Repetitions too can be seen in this source. Repetitions. Okay, you know what's meaning of repetitions. So, these things too can be seen in this source. So, therefore, Mahavamsa was composed as a historical chronicle with lesser mistakes than Deepavamsa. Okay, now here, but here if we compare the Mahavamsa and Deepavamsa, we can see lesser mistakes than Deepavamsa. Now here, Mahavamsa is the text with several parts. There are several parts. The first part of it was written by Bhikkhu named Mahanama. Okay, these points are very important. Who lived in the Diksandasenavia Peruana monastery. So, as in Deepavamsa, the first part of Mahavamsa consists of the historical information of this country from the arrival of the Lord Buddha to Sri Lanka up to the end of the ruling time of King Mahasen. So, this part had been written in about 5th or 6th century AD. So, one can see a certain similarity between the information of Deepavamsa and the first part of Mahavamsa. There can be seen a similarity between Deepavamsa and the Mahavamsa, especially about the first part of Mahavamsa. So, the reason for this may have been the influence of the early text as Sihal Attakatha Mahavamsa, Uttara Vihara Attakatha and Vinaya Attakatha, which were written before these two sources. Normally Pute, so before they are composing Mahavamsa, they have grabbed some information from the early sources, just like Attakatha, Sihal Attakatha Mahavamsa, Uttara Vihara Attakatha and Vinaya Attakatha. So because they were written before these two sources. After the first part of Mahavamsa was written by Mahanama Thera, so some other writers extended Mahavamsa as a continuous text with several parts by including some information about their contemporary time periods from time to time. Okay, by the time it has been extended. Therefore, the history of Sri Lanka has been written continuously in Mahavamsa. But here we can see long time period of history in Mahavamsa, as there are a limited number of countries which the history has been written in one continuous text. Sri Lanka can be proud because of the history of this country has been written in one text. So here Mahavamsa is most appropriate text which we can use to study our past events. So Mahavamsa is considered more credible historical source because some historical events recorded in it have been substantiated by the inscriptions and some other sources. Normally Pute, Mahavamsa is considered more credible historical sources because some historical events recorded in it have been substantiated by the inscriptions and some other sources. We can prove some factors from the inscriptions and some other sources which included in Mahavamsa. So about 4 centuries after writing of Mahavamsa in Pali, an annotation was compiled in order to interrupt by explaining some areas. Now here, about 4 centuries after writing of Mahavamsa, in Pali, an annotation was compiled in order to interrupt it by explaining some areas. That text, which is called the Mahavamsa Tikava, annotation of Mahavamsa. So, his name as Vantasappakasini. Now here these names also very important. Somehow it can come to your MCQ paper. So, it consists of lot of information which are not available in some other sources. Now here Putala you can see type of source, the examples, Sandesha Kavya, Mayura Tisara Salalihini Sandesha. Prasasti Kavya, normally we are using this Prasasti Kavya to appreciate some character, Parakumbha Sirita. So Hatan Kavya, Hatan means just like the fight and something like that. So Hatan Kavya also they are Sitavaka Hatana, Constantinu Hatana, Ingrisi Hatana. Here from this table you can see a few ancient literary sources consisting different content from each other. A number of books which can be considered to be local literary works had been written from Anuradhapura era to Kandyan era of the history of this country. Now here, there are a number of books which can be considered to be local literary works. So here written from Anuradhapura era to Kandyan era of the history of our country. So here the books considered as Buddhist religious texts as Bodhivamsa, Thupavamsa, Dhatuvamsa, Pujavaliya and Saddharma Lankaraya. So somehow in your exam they will ask you to mention about these kind of religious texts. So you have to keep these points in your mind. So these are important to study history of Rajarata civilization. Here these are very important to study the history of Rajarata civilization. Rajarata, okay. So the Nikaya Sangrahaya, which has been written on the history of the Buddhist order, Nikaya Sangrahaya, normally here it consists of Buddhist order, Sasana and Rajavaliya, which includes political information of the country. Here from the Rajavaliya, it gives the political information of the country. So these are important sources of studying history from Gampala to Kotte period. So here Sandesha Kavya, Prasasti Kavya and Hatan Kavya are important to study the history between the periods of Kotte and Kandy. So some examples are given in the table number 1.1. The local books were written during the different periods and the reasons which influenced to write them are different. So the books which had been written from Anuradhapura era to the beginning of Kotte era have had religious objectives. Especially we all know about that. Normally Putala, the books which had been written from Anuradhapura era to the beginning of Kotte era. So we can see some here when we are referring them. So we can see there are religious objectives in those literary sources. Some books were written a few centuries after the historical incidents which have been mentioned in the same books. So therefore when we form our history using the literary sources, we have to pay our attention to the facts given below. Okay, when you are referring these kind of sources, you should pay your attention on these factors, the following factors. The time in which the source were written, especially, you should observe these things. So here, the time in which the source were written. The second point, the author of the source. Okay, author of the source. If we take the Mahavamsa, there's another person, and if we take the Deepavamsa, there's another person. So you have to pay your attention the author of the source. So the author's objectives. Normally Putala, this is the thing. Normally if the author is the Thero, so we can see normally the most factors are related to the Buddhist Sasana. That's the thing. Okay, but somehow we can see. So the way in which facts were obtained for the source. Here if we take the Mahavamsa also, they grabbed some information from the previous text. So likewise, the way in which facts were obtained for the source, we have to pay our attention about the factors. So therefore you may understand that you have to be clever when you refer to the sources. Okay, so therefore you may understand that you have to be clever when you refer to the sources. Okay Putala, next day I hope to come with the foreign sources. See you soon.